I would love to thank John and the Maine Historical Society and the Wadsworth Longfellow House for inviting me to come. And I thank you all for being here. I hired a publicist once who told me that whenever I schedule an event, I need to guarantee an audience. So a lot of my family members are here. Thank you so much for showing up. And I see a lot of also unfamiliar faces, so I hope you will enjoy the talk and learn something that you didn't know before. So I will begin. So as a child, I loved the poetry of Longfellow and Poe, and I still know poems by both poets by heart. However, as a teenager, I came under the influence of the modernists, and Longfellow and Poe fell off my radar screen. My interest in Longfellow was rekindled a few years ago when my niece and her family moved to Portland. On our first visit, we went to the Portland Headlight, and I noticed the inscription about Longfellow and his poem, The Lighthouse. Until then, I hadn't been aware that Longfellow was from Portland. 3 years ago, I visited the Wadsworth Longfellow House for the first time. On my return to New York City, I began to research Longfellow's life and work. When I came across the incident that Poe called the Little Longfellow War, I thought it would make a good story. I soon discovered that literary scholars have already written about it, but I thought I still might have something to contribute to the conversation. If Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman are the two greatest 19th century American poets, Longfellow and Poe are of the next tier. In his day, Longfellow was more highly regarded. Today, Poe is. Their lives offer us a lens and mirror on family, society, and the culture of their time, on the imaginative life and sources of creativity, and indeed on literature itself. In almost every way, Longfellow and Poe are opposites. Take slavery, for example. Longfellow came from an anti-slavery family, and he became a staunch abolitionist. When he visited Dickens in England in 1842, Dickens showed him the manuscript of his American Notes and urged Longfellow to write anti-slavery poems. On his voyage back to America, Longfellow complied, and a 31-page chapbook, Poems on Slavery, was published in Boston at the end of the year. Like Uncle Tom's Cabin, published 10 years later, the poems on slavery are both sentimental and radical, cliched and realistic. They pleased the abolitionists, like Longfellow's close friend, Massachusetts Congressman Charles Sumner, and were condemned by many others. They were so controversial that when Longfellow's poems were reprinted in the abolitionist bastion of Philadelphia, the poems on slavery were omitted by the publishers without any authorization and for political reasons. Among the critics, the negative critics of poems on slavery was Poe, who, writing in the short-lived New York monthly The Aristidean in April 1845, referred to the poems as incendiary doggerel intended for the special use of those Negrophilic old ladies of the North who formed so large a part of Mr. Longfellow's friends. We dismiss this volume with no more profound feeling than that of contempt. Although born in Boston, Poe identified himself as a Southerner and disparaged the city of his birth. He was raised in Richmond, Virginia, by his foster parents, John and Fanny Allen. Allen's import-export business, Ellis and Allen, dealt in every commodity the two partners could broker, including slaves and even plantations. Allen himself owned 3 slaves. Poe's disparagement of Longfellow's abolitionism is accusatory. No doubt, it is a very commendable and very comfortable thing in the professor to sit at ease in his library chair and write verses instructing the Southerners how to give up their all with a good grace and abusing them if they will not. But we have a singular curiosity to know how much of his own, under a change of circumstances, the professor himself would be willing to surrender. There were other profound differences between the two poets. Born to a prominent family, Longfellow enjoyed a fortunate upbringing and a loving home. He was secure in his lineage as a Mayflower descendant and never tried to present himself as other than who he was. Poe, on the other hand, was orphaned at an early age. A fabulist, Poe was continually inventing false, exotic, and exalted histories and stories about himself. Among his many falsehoods was kinship with the traitor Benedict Arnold through his mother, Elizabeth Arnold Poe. He conceived of himself as an aristocrat Montquet, and following his idol Byron, he claimed to have fought for freedom in Poland and been imprisoned in St. Petersburg. Stories that were complete inventions, though they fooled some of his earlier biographers. In American literature, Poe is our greatest portrayer of the inner life, laying bare the contradictions and struggles of his secret self. Longfellow, on the other hand, looks outward in much of his writing, to history, community, culture, and society. In poems such as Hiawatha, Evangeline, and Paul Revere's Ride, Longfellow forged stories of national identity. Ever the professor, he conducted historical research and incorporated words from Ojibwe, Chippewa, and Dakota Sioux into Hiawatha, which is set in Minnesota and based on a Chippewa legend. He similarly researched the Acadians to write Evangeline, his best-selling poem in his lifetime. Longfellow's earnings from poetry and other writings enabled him to retire from his Harvard professorship while still in his 40s. No other American poet has been as celebrated or popular as he during their lifetimes. When he paid a visit to Queen Victoria, her servants hid in the curtains to catch a glimpse of their beloved poet, astonishing the Queen. Longfellow and T.S. Eliot are the only American poets to be commemorated in the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, and Eliot is as English as he is American. Poe never enjoyed anything approaching Longfellow's popularity during their lifetimes, but at the end of the 19th century, after both poets were dead, the scales were reversed, and Poe's writings eclipsed Longfellow's in popularity. During their lives, however, the rivalry was all on Poe's side. Longfellow was too secure to consider Poe as a rival. Yet Poe did not begin casting Longfellow as his enemy. On May 3, 1841, 4 years before his review of Longfellow's poems on slavery, writing as an editor of Graham's magazine in Philadelphia, the 32-year-old Poe penned a request to Longfellow, 2 years his senior, and at the time, Smith Professor of Modern Languages at Harvard. To impress the Professor of Modern Languages, Poe self-consciously sprinkled his entreaty with French phrases and flattered him with compliments. Dear Sir, Mr. George R. Graham, proprietor of Graham's Magazine, a monthly journal published in this city and edited by myself, desires me to beg of you the honor of your contribution to its pages. Upon the principle that we seldom obtain what we very anxiously covet, I confess that I have but little hope of inducing you to write for us. And to say the truth, I fear that Mr. Graham would have opened the negotiation much better on his own person, for I have no reason to think myself favorably known to you. But the attempt was to be made, and I make it. I should be overjoyed if we should get from you an article each month, either poetry or prose, length and subject à description. In respected terms, we would gladly offer you carte blanche, and the periods of payment should also be made to suit yourself. In conclusion, I cannot refrain from availing myself of this, the only opportunity I may ever have, to assure the author of The Hymn to the Night, of The Beleaguered City, and of The Skeleton in Armor, of the fervent admiration with which his genius has inspired me, and which bears with it, at best, more or less of niaiserie, were I not convinced that Professor Longfellow, writing and thinking as he does, will be at no less to feel and to appreciate the honest sincerity of what I say. Your obedient servant, Edgar A. Poe. As Poe anticipated, Longfellow turned down the request. In a non-committal yet gracious response, he conveyed to Poe his compliments. May 19, 1841. Your favor of the 3rd, with the 2 numbers of the magazine, reached me only a day or 2 ago. I am much obliged to you for your kind expression of regard, and to Mr. Graham for his very generous offer, of which I should gladly avail myself under other circumstances. But I am so much occupied at present that I cannot do it with any satisfaction either to you or to myself. I must therefore respectfully decline this proposition. You are mistaken in supposing that you are not favorably known to me. On the contrary, all that I have read from your pen has inspired me with a high idea of your power, and I think you are destined to stand among the first romance writers of the country, if such be your aim. The 2 writers never met, and this exchange marked the beginning and end of their correspondence. Nevertheless, their names have been linked in the annals of American cultural history because of Poe's literary attacks against Longfellow 4 years later in 1845, which Poe titled The Little Longfellow War. Of the charges Poe leveled against Longfellow, the most serious was plagiarism. In his January 1845 review of Longfellow's The Waif, which appeared in the Daily Mirror, Poe observed, "We conclude our notes on The Waif with the observation that, although full of beauties, it is infected with a moral taint. Somebody is a thief." Poe accused Longfellow not of copying others' words verbatim, which is our contemporary understanding of plagiarism, but of appropriating others' ideas, meters, rhythms, and images. Longfellow, he charged, was guilty of the most barbarous class of literary robbery, the class in which, while the words of the wronged author are avoided, his most intangible and therefore least defensible and least reclaimable property is purloined. 2 months later, in March, now editing the New York-based Broadway Journal, Poe took advantage of his position to expand his charges of plagiarism against Longfellow in several installments written in response to Longfellow's friends, who had sent protests to the Daily Mirror in his defense, including a mysteriously named Altus from the Greek for nobody, whose long essay Poe reproduced verbatim from the Daily Mirror to the Broadway Journal, prefacing an even more lengthy response. Poe's elaboration of this large account of a small matter filled the pages of the Broadway Journal for 6 consecutive weeks, from March 1st to April 5th, 1845. What is plagiarism, questioned Altus, and what constitutes a good ground for the charge? Did no 2 men ever think alike without stealing one from the other? Or thinking alike, did no 2 men ever use the same or similar words to convey the thoughts, and that without any communication with each other? To deny it would be absurd. Then Altus launched into several examples of similar images that emerged from the pens of different poets. For example, trees hung with icicles like crystal chandeliers. Images are not created, but suggested, reasoned Altus. And why not the same images when the circumstances are precisely the same to different minds? In my essay, Poe versus Himself, published in the New England Review, and available here, after my talk, I summarized Poe's and Altus's examples and counterexamples of Longfellow's guilt or innocence of plagiarism. Altus concluded his commentary, "Though acquainted with Mr. Longfellow, I have no acquaintance with Mr. Poe. I have written what I have written from no personal motives, but simply because from my earliest reading of reviews and critical notices, I have been disgusted with this wholesale mangling of victims without rhyme or reason. I scarcely remember an instance where the resemblances detected were not exceedingly far-fetched and shadowy and only perceptible to a mind predisposed to suspicion and accustomed to splitting hairs. Alice's epistle galvanized Poe to a counter-response of nearly 15,000 words, in which his tone veered from the almost reasonable to the nearly hysterical. Beset by emotion, Poe allowed the tone of his rebuttal to Altus to escalate until it is hard not to read in it a dominant note, to use a term Poe might have employed, of ressentiment. Amounting to more than resentment, ressentiment is a deeper grievance, which often, as in this case, has its basis in disparities of wealth and social class. The plagiarist, wrote Poe, is either a man of no note or a man of note. In the first case, he is usually an ignoramus and getting possession of a rather rare book, plunders it without scruple on the ground that nobody has ever seen a copy of it except himself. In the second case, which is a more general one by far, he pilfers from some poverty-stricken and therefore neglected man of genius on the reasonable supposition that this neglected man of genius will be too poor and too cowed to dare accuse of so base a thing as theft the wealthy and triumphant gentleman of elegant leisure. In Poe's conception, he saw himself as this neglected man of genius, and Longfellow as the wealthy and triumphant gentleman of elegant leisure. Longfellow's lineage was secure, his grandfather was a prominent judge, and his father was a prosperous attorney who had represented his Maine district in the House of Representatives. Longfellow had been privately tutored as a boy and completed his education at Bowdoin College, where his father was one of the founding trustees, Nathaniel Hawthorne, one of his classmates, and Franklin Pierce in the class ahead of him. With his knowledge of French, Spanish, Italian, and German, his years of European travel, his academic sinecure at Harvard, and his comfortable existence in beautiful, historic Craigie House in rooms once occupied by George Washington, Longfellow enjoyed a life of privilege that was everything that Poe's life was not. Orphaned at an early age, disowned by his guardian, whose fortune he had expected to inherit, forced to withdraw from the University of Virginia after 1 year because of gambling debts, and thus deprived of a university education and degree, addicted to drugs and alcohol, Poe lived a life in constant turmoil. Nevertheless, Poe considered himself to be Longfellow's intellectual superior. Poe was a self-proclaimed literary theoretician devoted to reason, logic, and rigor, an autodidact who cleaved to high self-imposed standards. An intellectual outside of the academy, Poe had all the brilliance and dangerous notions of a man who had developed his ideas in relative isolation. In contrast, Longfellow, despite his formal education, was a dreamy popularizer and a borrower from other cultures, whose poetry inhabited moods and tales rather than ideas, and who showed little interest in literary theories. Poe couldn't forgive Longfellow for his popularity, his embrace by the literary and academic establishment and the less sophisticated public, who were reassured and comforted by Longfellow's didacticism, even as they were enthralled to the music of his verses and his narrative skills. In contrast, Poe depicted himself as an independent voice of poetic principles, railing against charlatans like Longfellow and their cowardly, anonymous defenders like Altus. In the 170 years since Poe published this diatribe, the identity of Altus has been the subject of speculation among scholars. Attacking Poe was one of the surest routes to popularity in most of the literary circles of the time, yet no writer stepped forward to take credit for Altus, and Longfellow himself professed ignorance of the matter, although Altus claimed to be a friend of his. So long after the fact, the person of Altus remains a mystery, and Poe's motives in initiating and prolonging the controversy a matter of debate. Was Poe exhibiting more of his out-of-control, crazy behavior and promulgating the Little Longfellow War? How seriously should we take his charges? Were his literary criticisms credible, if cranky? In his long rebuttal to Alice, Poe offers a clue to his motivations when he defends himself against the charge of unpopularity. In 1 year, the circulation of the Southern Messenger, a $5 journal, extended itself from 700 to nearly 5,000, and that, in little more than twice the same time, Graham's magazine swelled its list from 5 to 52,000 subscribers. In my essay, Poe versus Himself, I argue that the Little Longfellow War was a publicity stunt instigated by Poe in an effort to try to increase the circulation of the Broadway Journal, as he had with previous periodicals. In Poe's day, as well as in ours, controversy sold copies, and Poe's quarrel with Longfellow was not the first nor the last literary feud that he provoked for the sake of boosting sales. While purporting to criticize Poe, Altus flattered him, alluding to his beautiful and powerful poem, The Raven, and playing the same word game with Poe's name as Poe had done earlier. Mr. Edgar A. Poe. Write it rather Edgar, a poet, and then it is right to a T. Alice was a useful invention for Poe, giving him an adversary in a public forum whom he could manipulate to his heart's content. Far from a pathetic wreck on the verge of mental collapse, thoroughly embarrassed and driven to his wits' end to vindicate himself, as his biographer Sidney Moss described him, Poe was an obsessive, self-promoting schemer with a rapier-sharp wit, a love of intrigue, and an enjoyment of the joke that turned on itself like a Mobius strip. Indeed, these are the aspects of his character and his writing that speak so forcefully to our present day. Throughout its 6-week duration, the Little Longfellow War was a one-sided skirmish. If Poe had hoped to provoke Longfellow's response in his own defense, he did not succeed. When beset by critics, both at this time and throughout his life, Longfellow sheathed his pen. That is not to say that Longfellow was not upset by Poe's attacks. During that spring of 1845, he confessed privately in his journal that he damns censorious Poe. He could have been speaking of Poe when he wrote, "A young critic is like a boy with a gun. He fires at every living thing he sees. He thinks only of his own skill, not of the pain he is giving." Perhaps it was precisely because Longfellow was so pained by negative criticism, Poe's and others, that he made efforts to protect himself from its effects by creating a mental distance. In his Table Talk, a collection of his notes and aphorisms published posthumously, he noted, "A great part of happiness of life consists not in fighting battles, but in avoiding them. A masterly retreat is in itself a victory." Poe could afford to ignore his critics. No other American poet before or since has enjoyed such great popular success or tremendous sales. Today's comparison would have to be to literary singer-songwriters such as Bob Dylan, Paul Simon, or Leonard Cohen. Of greater concern to him than harsh criticism was the need for stricter international copyright law to prevent the piracy of his works overseas. He urged his close friend, Congressman Sumner, to introduce this legislation, an effort in which he was joined by Charles Dickens, who also suffered from copyright piracy. Samuel Longfellow, his brother and biographer, estimated that for want of an international copyright, the poet forfeited $40,000 in income in 19th century dollars, a fortune. As I have noted, plagiarism in the mid-19th century had a different meaning than today. Then, plagiarism might refer to any literary borrowing, whether conscious or unconscious. In this broad sense, every writer is a plagiarist, and every plagiarism is not a crime. Critics could not agree if ideas were copyrightable. Could an idea be attributed to a single author? And how specific or original did the idea have to be to belong to the author? Plagiarism scholar Sandy Leonard has suggested that once stricter international copyright laws were established, the conception of plagiarism began to shift to a demonstrable notion of copying verbatim with intention. The establishment of a legal standard redefined our understanding of plagiarism, rather than the other way around. For Poe, the point was not the justice of his accusations against Longfellow, but the incitement of a controversy and the attendant publicity. The wrong that he was seeking to redress was not literary theft, but the unfairness of life that decreed that Longfellow was rich and successful, and he was poor and obscure. Nevertheless, the charge of plagiarism was more than a convenience for Poe. Themes of plagiarism, influence, doubling, and imitation, which penetrated deep into Poe's psyche, are expressed in his troubling fictions and colored all of his literary and professional relationships. Poe's hypersensitivity to this subject and the complexity of his twisted, contradictory responses continue to exert their fascination, offering insight into the demonic psyche, the individual in extremis. Balance, proportion, and moderation were Longfellow's qualities. But Longfellow, a lifelong student of and translator of Dante, recognized a soul in torment, and he pitied Poe the man while appreciating his poetic talents. Author and critic William Winter, who befriended Longfellow during his Harvard days in the 1850s until Longfellow's death 30 years later, recalled that the older poet kept a volume of Poe's poems on his table, singling out for special praise Poe's late poem, For Annie. When asked to recommend an epitaph for Poe's 1875 memorial, Longfellow chose the line, "The fever called living is conquered at last," from For Annie. After Poe's death, Longfellow provided financial support to Poe's aunt and mother-in-law, Maria Clem. Taking the long view, he said to Winter, "I never answered Mr. Poe's attacks, and I would advise you now, at the outset of your literary life, never to take notice of any attacks that may be made upon you. Let them all pass. My work seemed to give him much trouble, first and last. But Mr. Poe is dead and gone, and I am alive and still writing, and that is the end of the matter." Thank you.
Anybody have any questions for Anne?
Yeah. Yes?
I was struck by the story of Queen Victoria's servants peeking out from behind the curtain to see Longfellow. There's a story that she said to Longfellow, the Queen said, "Oh, Mr. Longfellow, I'm so happy to meet you. All my servants read you." And one biographer can't figure out if she was giving him a subtle put down or if she was really praising him. It sounds to me, it wouldn't be like Queen Victoria to insult someone to their face like that.
I don't think she was insulting him. That detail came from, I think I got that detail from Samuel Longfellow's biography of his brother, and that was late in Longfellow's life, where he took an entourage of some of his children after his wife had died, and traveled in splendor and was invited to meet the Queen. And the way that the brother, Samuel Longfellow, portrays it is that the Queen had no idea. She knew that she valued him and that the literary intelligentsia valued him, but she had no idea that he was so popular among the common people. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming. And this lady is, she introduced herself to me. She actually works at the Longfellow House in Cambridge on Rattle Street. So I hope, it's a wonderful place, so I hope all of you who are here will have the opportunity to visit that house too. So, yes?
Yeah, I was wondering if you were, I guess it sounded as though you were questioning about whether the possibility that Poe was the author of the Anonymous.
He is the author of the I think he is.
You think he is?
I believe that,
Oh,
yes.
that's
And
right.
other people have agreed with me, over the years. Some biographers not, some yes, but that's what I think.
And is there any evidence for that of the sort of physical form? If someone found a draft.
Oh, I really don't know that. I
So
don't know
the
that.
evidence is basically that he probably wanted to stir up controversy, and this was.
It's part of his personality. And it's very interesting. I hope to develop this. This is taken from my essay that's in the New England Review, and I wrote a second chapter, which is actually published online. And if you go to my website, it's in the Rascal Journal, and that's called Poe and Chivers. Chivers was this deservedly forgotten Southern poet who really wanted to befriend Poe and save him from himself, but he was a really bad poet. But yeah, even so, which is very interesting. I didn't really go into it here, but in the Little Longfellow War, there's this whole back and forth between Aldous and Poe, and there's one point where Aldous, I mentioned it briefly here, really praises the raven, but then talks about the idea that the raven came from this other poem that critics have tried to find it, no one's ever found it. But in fact, what's really interesting is that Poe did plagiarize parts of in his term of plagiarism, copy parts of the meter and the refrain from Chivers. So the epigraph to that second chapter I just couldn't resist, is taken from This Is Spinal Tap. There's a fine line between clever and stupid. Because it's very, you'll see, we can read it, that's my point. But yes. So I just think it's pretty much, to me, just reading the evidence, Aldous was Poe. I don't see who else he could have been. So anyway, and Poe did this. Yes.
So if you're correct about that, was Poe innovative for the time in having this kind of a PR strategy for himself, or are there other examples that are known of similar kind of?
Well, I think, I don't know about anything before that, but I think that writers have always, worked very hard to promote themselves whatever way they could, particularly poets. I mean, Whitman was famous for taking Emerson's words, I agree with you, at the beginning of a great career, that was written in a private letter and had it plastered all over leaves of grass. And, actually, in my second chapter too, the thing that makes Poe great in a way too, I think, is that he had such a sense of humor. You read these things and you just laugh because he's so witty, he's so humorous. Chivers is like Poe with lead without any sense of humor, so he actually did the same thing. I point this out later in his life after Poe was dead. He created this whole controversy, but it was so annoying that the editor said, I've never published anything by you or this other person again. Forget it. So Poe had that, he always felt he was a misunderstood genius, so, but I don't know how widespread that practice was. Yeah.
It seems like you might be able to read the letter that Poe wrote to Longfellow asking for his submission. Did they know each other then at all, or no?
No, they never met in person, and that was really their only direct correspondence.
Okay. Well,
It's printed.
It almost seems like Poe's going on too much, but maybe that's the style of the day.
I think he's flattering. Yeah, he's flattering him. He's dropping in all those French phrases because he knows he's a professor of modern languages. I mean, Poe did have some of his education as a very young man. As a boy, he was taken to England by his stepfather, his foster father, who never actually adopted him, who at that time doted on him, and he did, attend a very, pretty fancy private school, which is later, and he memorialized that in William Wilson. So he had some advantages, but they came to a crashing halt, you know. He had the expectation that he would be as privileged and wealthy as Longfellow was, and then, you know, he was disowned, so, by his foster father. So, yes?
Did you find anything about the Portlander John Neal, who knew both men, published Poe, knew Longfellow well, threaded between the two, and I always wondered what he thought of this whole mess that you've described.
No, I haven't. I will have to look that up. I have not heard from him. I heard about him. I will have to do some research. I'm trying to develop this manuscript, you know, into like a short book, so I'm still sort of working on it. This is the beginning, so. So I'm selling my poetry collections, and that is a deep discount of $12, which if anybody wants them, I'll be happy to sign them for people. And does anyone else have any questions? And yes?
Do we know the reason that Poe was disowned by his foster family?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. Poe is very popular, and there's a ton of biographies about him and a lot written about him. So he was adored by his foster mother, and his foster father was this kind of dour Scotsman who was really upset when Poe didn't want to make money and, you know, go into the family business. But also, Poe provoked his foster father a lot. I mean, he just spent all the money, and he went into debt, and he pushed at it. And he was as horrible to Allen as Allen was to him, but also there was this whole thing with Fanny Allen and John Allen that he adored Fanny, and she could have no children. Well, Allen wasn't faithful to her because he had several illegitimate children out of wedlock. So there's a whole theory that Poe took his foster mother's side against his foster father, and then when she died, he really had no champion. And then the foster father remarried, and the new wife didn't want to have anything to do with him, and he had never been legally adopted, so they kind of kicked him out. His father, there's all this. That's a very interesting correspondence.